Well, here we are. Welcome to SMU. I know many of you have been on this beautiful campus before, and some of you have probably never been in this beautiful new building that we have, which is a little bit like a maze. I thought it was complicated before they remodeled it, but it's even more complicated now, and they were cleaning the steps. So we apologize for the problems getting in here. And some of you may have noticed that we have two crumb auditoriums. The one here and the one over in the Collins building, which is behind this. So I hope you didn't get too lost. So for those of you who do not know who I am, my name is Jim Hollifield. I'm a professor here and the director of the Tower Center. And I don't know, I think we had like 250 people or something who signed up for this. Is there election coming up? I think. You would think the fate of the republic sort of hinges on what's going to happen here in a few weeks, and maybe it does. But it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, who is going to introduce the panel. And here's how we're going to do this. There's going to be a discussion for about 45 minutes among the three of them, which you can listen to. And then we're going to stop, and it's going to be your turn to ask questions. My colleague over here, Astrid, who worked so hard to set this up, had been using some kind of QR code or something with iPads and iPhones, but we're just going to let you ask questions tonight. So, and I know that Lee will make sure everybody, if you have a speech, don't make it. If you have a question, please ask it. So no speeches tonight. So I think everybody, many of you in the room here know who Lee Cullum is. She's not only a longtime friend, she's a colleague of mine in the Tower Center. I've worked with her for quite a number of years, and I've seen her in action. I know what a pro she is. She's going to be ready to walk us through this tonight, this landmark election that we're coming up on. So Lee's biography is in the flyer. I encourage you to have a look at it. She's a very noted journalist. I refer to her as Dallas's most important public intellectual. That's what I call her. And she is a very, very astute moderator. So I'm going to turn this over now to Lee, and she will introduce the other two panelists, who are both colleagues of mine as well. And then it's going to be your turn to ask questions. So please join me in welcoming Lee Cullum.
Thank you, Jim. You're characteristically generous, and I'm grateful to you for not telling all that you know. That's a great help. There was a time early in the 20th century in London when George Bernard Shaw was at a dinner for a colleague, very distinguished, or that's what he thought he was anyway. And he got up and said, "I only have 10 minutes to tell you all I know." And Shaw said, "Well, you must speak very slowly." Well, that is not true of our two here tonight. They are distinguished and also extremely knowledgeable. I don't think we can gather all the insights they have in the time we have tonight. We have Cal Jilson and Matthew Wilson, both political scientists, as I said. He got a PhD from the University of Maryland, Matthew from Duke University, so they're both mid-Atlantic people in that particular respect. Both over at Carr Collins Hall, in offices next door to each other, one in 14, one in 15, and in 2014, 214, 215. You'll know where to find them if you want to when tonight is over, if you have any complaints to make. They both are very knowledgeable about politics and really interested in how politics works at every level, in an intellectual level, on the ground level. They're interested in polling, they're interested in public opinion, they're interested in elections themselves and how they are conducted, which is a big question for the next 3 weeks. And Cal also has done a lot of research on Texas politics, and that can be backbreaking work. So glad for that. And Matthew is very interested in religion and politics, and in fact directs the Center for Faith and Learning. It couldn't be more important. So it's Cal Jilson, it's Matthew Wilson. So we have the Jilson and Wilson show tonight. And Matthew, let's look at your interest in religion and politics. Is there, of course, we know that the Catholic Church, Evangelical Church, Black churches are always interested in politics, but is it waning across the electorate? Is there the same interest there used to be?
So I think two things are simultaneously going on that cut in different directions. So on one hand, there are trends of secularization in the American electorate. So the number of people who attend church regularly, the number of people who identify with a religious denomination is lower than it once was. But among those who remain regular churchgoers and continue to identify with a denomination, their level of politicization is higher than it has been in the past. So those two things kind of cut in opposite directions. So religion remains a really important predictor of vote choice, of policy positions. It's in fact more predictive than a lot of things that get more attention. We hear a lot about the gender gap, for example. And of course, the gender gap is significant. But the God gap, as some scholars have called it, is much larger. That is, the difference in partisan preference between regular churchgoers and people who attend religious services seldom or never is much larger than the partisan gap between men and women. So it remains a really significant predictor of how people are going to behave politically. And of course, there are a lot of complicated cross currents for candidates to navigate with that.
I can remember, and probably you can too, when Jack Kennedy went to Houston to meet with Methodist bishops and assure them that the Vatican would not dictate to him in any way. He was loyal to the Constitution. He had gone to some trouble to lay the groundwork for this argument by voting against federal funding for parochial schools when he was in the Senate. And of course, then we came to Jimmy Carter, 1976, born again Christian. It didn't seem to be controversial, but it was certainly in the picture. Later, Romney, a Mormon, a bishop in the Mormon church. Okay, we all understood that. And this year it seems to me we really don't have much idea about the religious life of the two who are running, which is unusual.
That's right. I mean, they are relatively secular compared to many candidates in the past. Now, that doesn't mean they don't court religious constituencies, but neither one of them has foregrounded any sort of religious identity as being kind of central to their political worldview.
Well, Cal, I read in the New York Times just last week that there are conservative Christians who are feeling quite frustrated with Trump. I don't know why, because he delivered what he promised. I mean, he got Roe v. Wade repealed. That's what he promised to do. That's what he did. And yet they're still frustrated. They feel maybe he's pulling away from them, or they're not going to be as influential.
Yeah, I saw that that same article, which would suggest that some evangelicals are breaking away from Donald Trump, even though, as Matt suggested, most evangelicals who do vote lean in the Republican direction. And I think that the abortion issue was the sort of proximate cause of some evangelicals moving away from Trump, because he's equivocated more than once, sort of consistently, on how to describe his position in regard to abortion as recently as just yesterday. So I think some have become disgusted with him, but evangelicals are still an important part of his base.
I would think so. Well, what about the MAGA party? I mean, when Trump departs the scene, whenever that is, we don't know when that might be, what is to happen? I mean, Jim Hollyfield, who sends material to everybody all the time so we can stay enlightened, and we appreciate that. The Tower Center is always the voice of enlightenment. But this was a column by Janan Ganesh in the Federal Times, in the Financial Times, who said that when he leaves, that the party will perhaps regress to the mean, if I understand what he was saying, and will not be as committed, since they won't have him to lead the way, they will find their way back, perhaps. In fact, you answered it. You sent him an email saying, well, yeah, that looks pretty true to you. Do you still think that?
I think there's some qualifications that are necessary there. The Republican Party is going to look substantially different when Trump departs the scene, whenever that is and by whatever means that happens. But I think largely from the standpoint of no longer being bound to Trump's over-the-top, larger-than-life personal style. So that's going to be a lot different, right? Because Trump is, love him or hate him, he's a larger-than-life figure. He dominates the political landscape. He consumes all the oxygen in the room. So they will no longer have that to grapple with. But I don't think there's any returning to the status quo ante. I don't think there's any going back, certainly not entirely, maybe not even in large part, to the Republican Party of Mitt Romney. And I say this because the trends that have been shifting the Republican Party's issue stances are not unique to Donald Trump, and they're not unique to the United States. This is happening all over the world, all over certainly the advanced industrialized economies, that there's more and more pressure for populist politics, more and more skepticism of immigration, more and more cultural discomfort with the pace of change and with globalization, more and more economic and social discontent from blue collar folks. And I don't think you can put that genie back in the bottle. Now, that will be manifested in a very different way from how Trump does it. I mean, and maybe one path forward, and again, this is highly dependent on what happens in November, but I think one vision of what that might look like going forward is somebody like J.D. Vance, who certainly has articulates many of those aspects of a more populist ideology in a much smoother, more polished, frankly, more intelligent way than Donald Trump does. And whether that shift, if that's in fact the shift that happens, whether that's better for the Republican Party, whether that's better for the country, I mean, we could talk about those things for a long time. So I think there'll be a shift, but it will largely be a shift away from the personal style and impact of Donald Trump rather than a major ideological shift.
Well, it seems to me, Cal, when I look at what is now the MAGA party, we have two parties, the Democratic Party and the MAGA party. And the MAGA party is not in trouble. It owns the Supreme Court, has a good chance of taking the House, the Senate, and the White House. That's not a party in trouble. That's a party on the move. Very much like Marine Le Pen's party, now called the Rassemblement National. Jim can pronounce it better, the RN. Do you remember back in 2002, her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, very ill-mannered and of pretty strong and offensive views. Nonetheless, he got into a runoff with a sitting president, Jacques Chirac. Lost the runoff. The French kind of come back to their senses in a runoff. But I see the same thing happening. Now his daughter, Marine Le Pen, got rid of him, got some better manners for the party. I mean, less anti-Semitic, less anti-EU, seems to be pro-EU. But I see the same thing happening with MAGA.
Yeah, as Matt said, there is a populist movement around the world, including in the United States. And when Donald Trump does leave, that personality will be gone. And the question is whether J.D. Vance or anyone else can hold that party together. And my sense is probably not, because to the extent that it is populist, it begins to alienate the more traditional Republican elements, certainly the Wall Street elements, the upper income elements. And so if the Republican Party does become increasingly populist, it may lead the Democratic Party to become increasingly elitist, right? It's a high education party now, but it may well become a sort of upper middle class, wealthy party more than it has been. So its traditional roots in the middle class and the working class could go by the board. It may well be that the MAGA party captures that constituency, and we'll have two very different political parties, both of them trying to pull their new elements together. So I think we're in for turmoil going forward. We've had it for the Trump era. We're going to have it in the post-Trump era as well, I think.
Let me see if I have followed you. I mean, at the moment, we have the Democratic Party, which is the party of educated people, and the MAGA party, those who are less educated, less college educated. So you're saying that might flip?
Well, I'm saying that the Democratic Party understands itself to be the party of the working class and the middle class.
Trying to be.
But it has evolved over the course of the last several decades to become a highly educated, Wall Street-oriented party, so that Kamala Harris's brother-in-law and other of the economic theorists in the Democratic Party have been going around Wall Street investment houses in the last week, trying to gather ideas from them to refine Kamala Harris's ideas. So if the Democratic Party continues to leave its working class and middle class roots for that highly educated, wealthy base, it could leave the union workforce to J.D. Vance and the new Republican Party.
Yeah.
So it would become a rural party and a working class party.
This has already happened. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
This is already happening, right? I mean, it could continue to play out in the future, but it's really remarkable that for the first time in a very, very long time, the Teamsters Union didn't endorse anybody this year for president. It's pretty much in the past been a given. Of course, the Teamsters endorsed the Democrats, right? They're the Labor Party. But they didn't endorse anybody this year. And in fact, had they endorsed someone, it probably would have been Donald Trump. That is, he was apparently the preference of about 60% or 65% of Teamsters rank and file. So, the leadership just said, well, then we're just not going to endorse anybody. But I mean, that really speaks to this kind of shift that Cal's talking about.
Do you understand this stance of the Teamsters? I don't know of a recent president more pro-union than Joe Biden. And Harris has certainly done nothing to indicate she would move from that position. Well,
I mean, the Teamsters and some other people in the labor movement, they like Trump's promise of significant tariffs. They like his trade protectionism. They are convinced that he will be more committed to protecting American jobs than Kamala Harris would be. And what Cal talked about how the Democratic Party increasingly is courting big money, big finance, banking, that makes union guys suspicious, right? Because they see that as oil and water.
Well, then evidently they don't meet the low tax, low regulation people that I do who are voting for Trump for precisely that reason.
Yeah, there are a lot of people project onto Trump their preferred economic policies and assume that he can be persuaded or cajoled to ultimately do what they want.
Well, he has been. He's lowered taxes for high-income people.
He did. He lowered taxes. He also put in tariffs, though. He's done a mishmash of a lot of different kinds of things.
And that's the fissure in the Republican Party. Because Donald Trump did lower taxes overwhelmingly for the very wealthy, very modestly for lower income people. But those lower income people appreciated the little tax cuts they got and forgot about the bigger ones that other people got. So it'll be hard to hold the old Republican Party together. And as they come apart, they won't reform into two new parties quickly or easily.
Well, it seems to me that what Will Hurd likes to call normal Republicans, no, the normal Republicans are now the MAGA Republicans. So what's left of the traditional Republicans have got three choices. One is they can accept the offer from Ireland or Spain or Portugal and get a passport and invest some money there and try to have a good life. Secondly, they can form a new party, which Liz Cheney has said might be necessary. Thirdly, they can go along with the Democratic Party. And if they do, they'll move it to the middle because politicians will go where the voters are. Yeah. But do you see it this way?
Well,
they are left out.
Similarly, if you think about the old Republican Party in Texas, which was the party of Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush.
Peter O'Donnell. And
all of those people who built the Republican Party in Texas, who, when Ken Paxton was impeached and tried in the Senate, the whole defense of Paxton was the Republican Party is no longer that old Bush party. No. And so there's a dramatic change taking place. And, that's part of what makes this current election cycle so difficult to interpret and understand is there's so many moving parts, right? And, the reason you call a swing state is because they're traditionally close. And we have 7 states now that are within a percentage point, 1.5%, could go either way depending upon the events in the coming couple of weeks. So it's an unstable period.
Well, do you have any predictions? Go ahead, Ad, what you want to add?
I was just going to say that this is exactly right. But it's important to note that the turmoil and the hemorrhaging of certain constituencies, it's not all on the Republican side. If this were just a Republican issue, this would not be a 50-50 election. Right? If the Republican Party were breaking in half and the Democrats were just fine, then the Democrats would be cruising to victory. But of course, that's not what we see, right? We see a very, very closely divided election that could go either way. And part of that is because I would actually argue that the biggest thing right now holding the Democratic Party together and papering over some of the ideological divisions within the Democratic Party is Donald Trump. They despise, all flavors of Democrats despise Donald Trump. And they'll put aside their differences to a large degree to try to unite against him because he is the bête noire in their imagination. But when he's gone, I think some of those differences within the Democratic Party may start to get more airing, like the Bernie Sanders socialist folks versus the Wall Street Democrats. I mean, there's some irreconcilable policy differences between those kind of people. And also the very socially progressive identity politics wing of the Democratic Party versus the more centrist wing of the Democratic Party. You know, they're going to have to hash that out. So, I mean, I think we're in a period of realignment that we're going to see in both parties.
Would you agree that if you, that Kamala Harris, when she goes to bed at night, thinks, oh, the times are out of joint, oh, cursed spite, that ever I was born to set them right? Because she is born to set them right, isn't she? In the party, perhaps in the nation.
Yeah, I think one of the most remarkable things that has happened in this election cycle is to watch the Democratic Party just almost in collective tears with Joe Biden as their nominee, and then his performance in that debate led people to believe that he simply was not capable of doing another term. And then you'll remember the discussion was, will it go right to Kamala Harris, or should we open it up and have a conversation and a contest at the convention? That would have been absolute disaster. But the ability just to go to Kamala Harris smoothly over the course of a couple of days and to deliver the nomination to her and then see the fundraising and the volunteerism and everything pick up is something that I don't think any of us would have imagined. If Biden steps down, it'll smoothly go to Harris and her campaign will then go on to develop a lead. So I think we don't really know what either party is going to look like down the road because both of them are just trying to collapse across the finish line at this point.
Well, let's think about what the party might look like on February 1st. We hope we have a president and we hope we have an inauguration in late January and things go forward. Let's look at taxation. Do you have any idea what Harris has in mind? We know about the tax break she's talked about. I mean, $50,000 to start a business, $15,000 for a down payment on a house, $6,000 child care credit. But she said something that gave me pause, and it was a tax on unrealized capital gains. Is that what she's talking about when she talks about the wealthy paying their fair share?
That's part of what she's talking about. We're probably launching into a series of discussions here on various issues, and as we do that, we have to keep in mind that we have to see the resolution of the election. We have to know who the president is, who's in control of the House and the Senate, and whether we've got divided government or unified government. If we've got unified government, then maybe it makes a difference what Kamala Harris thinks on her tax program, because she may be able to actually get some congressional support. And if it's Trump and the Republicans, there'll be a very different set of policies. But it's likely to be divided government, which means we're going to get change on the margin. We're going to get the Trump tax program of 2017, which was passed giving benefits to the very wealthy, other benefits to other people. Much of that has to be renewed over the next 4 or 5 months. And depending on the shape of the government, it could be renewed in many different ways. But most of the things that both candidates, particularly Harris, I think, really advertise, and particularly this tax on unrealized gains. Just very quickly, when you buy a stock for $100 and hold it for 2 years and it's worth $200 at the end of that 2-year period, you've got $100 worth of unrealized capital gains. You sell that stock and you have to pay taxes on that $100 of unrealized gains. But for very large wealth holdings, unrealized gains are very large numbers, and there's no point at which you can stop calculating the unrealized gains, except January 1st every year. It's a mess. You couldn't do it, not going to happen, not something to worry about, but it is a major talking point for the Kamala Harris program.
Because as I understand it, as it is today, if you sell that stock, you pay the capital gains tax.
Right?
Her proposal is you pay the tax year after year after year, even if you've held it.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a wealth tax.
Yes, it is a wealth tax. And as those capital gains accrue, you pay on them seriatim rather than all at the end. But it's very difficult to calculate, and it would be very difficult to pass one of those through the Congress. So, you know, there are a lot of things we can think about, we don't have to worry about because they're not going to pass.
Well, yesterday, Trump told John Micklethwait at the Chicago Economic Club that he loves, loves, loves tariffs. It's the most beautiful word in the English language. And he has in mind some rather large tariffs, I think, 20% across the board, 60% on goods from China, 100% for countries who retreat from the dollar as its global currency of choice, and perhaps 200% on people he really doesn't like. So
Maybe 5,000%. Just keep throwing numbers out there. You know, I mean, yeah.
moreover, as you know, he told the Detroit Economic Club that don't worry about childcare, the money will roll in and it'll pay for all the childcare in the world you could ever desire. What's going to go on here? Could I add one thing more? There was a piece, maybe in the Financial Times and maybe both that in the New York Times, saying that what he really wants to do is eliminate the income tax, replace it with a tariff and maybe a VAT, a value-added tax like in Europe, which can be high, 20%. And that perhaps this move to cut no taxation on tips, no taxation on overtime, is just a nibbling away to get rid of the income tax and adopt the tariff. But can tariffs pay for the federal government?
No. And they shouldn't, and it's not going to happen. I mean, this is one of the things that is, I think Cal's right to keep in mind about this election. The candidates throw stuff out there that sounds good to the electorate, but I mean, central items of both candidates' economic platform have been virtually universally panned by economists who say these policies would be terrible if they were enacted. I mean, this sort of massive increase in tariffs is just a terrible economic policy. And look, I don't say this with any kind of partisan agenda, because let me also say that the tax on unrealized gains that Kamala Harris has proposed, just a terrible policy, just a terrible economic policy for the reasons that Cal mentioned. Another thing that Harris has proposed, giving first-time home buyers $25,000 to put towards the purchase of a home. Well, all the people who do real estate finance say all that's going to do is jack up home prices. If you just throw more money to first-time home buyers, because you know who that doesn't help? The second-time home buyer, right? Who then has to compete in the marketplace to buy properties that have been artificially subsidized with this. So anyway, my point is, I think very few of these signature economic policy proposals that either candidate is making are going to become law in anything resembling the format that they're talked about out on the campaign trail. Not only because the other party in Congress will fight to resist them, but because there will be people in their own parties that will say, whoa, 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 I don't think we want to do quite this. So it makes it hard to kind of evaluate what economic policy is going to look like depending on who wins, because you know some of the most talked about proposals from both sides are just manifestly bad ideas, and you know that's where we are.
Well, now let's look at the House and the Senate. I was reading, you probably were too. I see you're a reader of the New York Times, that in California, the Democrats are very excited. They think the Harris effect might enable them to flip 6 Republican House seats to the Democratic Party, which would hold the House, or return the House, shall we say, to the Democrats.
Yeah,
Possible?
it is possible. The House is going to be very close. The Republicans have a 4-vote lead. If Democrats win 4 current Republican seats, they'll be at even. And the place they're looking is California and New York, because in 2020 and 2022, normally Democratic seats flip to Republicans in those 2 states, and Democrats think that they can win some of them back. Long Island have several seats. There's an arc
How about
around the
George
northern
Santos?
part of the city.
Santos
And
is
then,
right.
yeah,
Great
and then
guy.
in California as well. So there are enough seats for the Democrats to take control of the House. And, you know, if I were to guess, I'm not going to guess on the presidential election. It's just, it's way too close. But I think Republicans take the Senate. They've already captured West Virginia. They're going to capture Montana for sure. And then I think probably Democrats hold Ohio. So it'll be very close. You know, Democrats are looking at Texas to see if they can knock off Cruz with Allred. I think, you know, getting from down 9 to down 6 was easy for Allred to do. Getting from down 3 to 0 is much more difficult. I don't expect it to happen, but I do think Republicans will narrowly control the Senate. And I think Democrats will probably very narrowly control the House as well, which will control a lot of this policy debate and hopefully will make for some kind of talk across the aisle. There has to be that on a number of issues. Renewing the Trump tax cuts has to be done. We are on a continuing resolution for next year's budget. That's got to be done. And the debt is also spiraling a lot out of control. Both Democrat and Republican programs would add to that debt. So there are things that just have to be done. And in divided government, sometimes you can actually do that more easily than you do it in unified government.
Nobody's talking about the debt. Have you noticed that? Right. Candidate is mentioning it. And it's, I mean, even the International Monetary Fund has come out saying this is appalling. It'll be 100% of the world GDP by the end of the decade, or so they say.
Right, but voters don't care. I mean,
They
this
don't
is why
care.
candidates don't have to talk about it, because voters in the abstract, when they're asked, they say, oh yeah, the debt, that's a bad thing. But they never spontaneously raise it or offer it as one of the central things that they're concerned about. It just has not penetrated the public consciousness as being a major problem. And until and unless it does, and I'm not holding my breath for that, until and unless it does, then candidates of both parties have an incentive to say, I'm going to start new programs, I'm going to give you more money from the government, and I'm going to cut your taxes, and we're just going to let the fiscal chips fall where they may. And that's essentially what both candidates are proposing, is more spending, lower taxes, in, you know, slightly different permutations, but big picture, they're both saying that: more spending, lower taxes, and the debt, well, we'll see.
Only once was the debt effectively addressed, and it was Ross Perot in 1992. He wasn't able to win the race for president, but he went around with his pie charts and patiently explained, you know, here's what we borrowed, here's what we owe. And I think that he was responsible for Clinton. Clinton cuts, you know, he arranged the budget to the point that he left with almost a balanced budget.
The combination of Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress in the mid to late 1990s
right.
worked to actually achieve fiscal sanity. Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich together essentially put us on a path of zero deficit. We were running surpluses.
Yeah, and it didn't work out because we had the wars that followed after 9/11. But let's look, well, one thing more. If we're going to have a Democratic House, who will be the Speaker? Any idea?
Oh, Hakeem Jeffries. I think the Democratic caucus in the House likes him a great deal.
Yeah, and
because he's a calm guy who listens. I think Democrats love the fact that Nancy Pelosi knew how to win, but she herded them like cats. And politicians are you know, they don't like that. They like a little more freedom. And I think Jeffries gives them that and listens more than Pelosi did.
Could I say cat ladies like a little more freedom too? J.D. Vance would give them.
But I would say also that on that point, we've seen with under the speakership that the Republicans have exercised in recent years, just how fun it is when you have a narrow majority and the speaker doesn't ride herd on people. Yeah. I mean, gets pretty chaotic. And this is going to be one of the issues, because I totally agree with Cal. Whichever party controls the House, it is highly unlikely to be a majority of more than 5 seats. Yeah. So
Pelosi had this same narrow majority.
Yeah.
And ran the place like clockwork.
Right.
But-
She got a little bit of grief from AOC and her ilk, but she smacked
Oh,
that
yeah.
down.
Yes, she
And
did.
yeah, now, when you have that kind of small majority, though, as we have seen, it can really empower your fringiest people, because all it takes is 5 to 10 folks on the far right or the far left of your caucus to totally gum up the works, unless the other party is willing to cooperate with the normal people in your party to help bail things out. But of course, the other party doesn't have an incentive to do that. They like to watch you twist in the wind and get completely run around in circles by your crazies. And that's what we've seen. And I think we're in probably for more of that.
Yeah, and what about the Senate? If the Republicans take the Senate, who do you see as the new leader replacing Mitch McConnell? What about our guy, John Cornyn?
He's a possibility, very much. He will have to reassure the more conservative members of his caucus that he is not Mitch McConnell redux. He'll have to convince them that he is not just a consummate establishmentarian, that he actually has some fire in the belly for conservative causes. So we'll see, whether he's able to do that.
No, I haven't heard the conservatives tell me in a long time what they believe. What are the conservative causes?
Well, I mean, to some degree,
The conservative causes, not populist causes.
Well, okay, so I mean, this is a big can
Uh-huh.
of worms as to how much does populism overlap with
Conservatism.
yeah.
Fair question.
I mean, so which will be part of what whoever wants to be the leader in the Senate would have to hash out with his own constituency, is where are they on that continuum between populism and conservatism. But I think it is more about, and this is increasingly a hallmark of our politics, it's more about style than it is about substance. I mean, John Cornyn will take the more rightward position in terms of his actual vote on every single issue that comes before the Senate. John Cornyn is not going to vote with the Democrats. He's not some sort of squishy centrist. But his personal style is more low-key, thoughtful, respectful, courtly. And there are some people who just don't like that approach to politics. They want somebody who's going to get in there and punch the other side in the mouth. And there will be people in the Republican caucus in the Senate who think John Cornyn is not the guy to punch the Democrats in the mouth. And that's going to be the difficulty that he'll have to overcome.
But John Thune, who is his main competitor for majority leader, minority leader, whatever it turns out to be, is a similar kind of low-key personality. But the Senate is more willing than the House to accept that. I mean, you have people like Josh Hawley, who might be out on the right fringe, but I think either Thune or Cornyn would really save the Senate Republican conference from its right wing. And there are a lot of senators who would appreciate that.
And I think actually
in the House.
Ted Cruz could do Cornyn a lot of good too, because he would support his fellow senator from Texas, presumably. And Cruz carries a lot of weight with conservatives, so I mean, he could be a real asset to Cornyn in that sense.
And what is it that Cruz is advocating that carries weight with conservatives?
Well, I mean, I'm just saying Cruz is a popular figure among conservatives, among conservative base. He's pretty well thought of.
Now, the reason he can't think of anything is I discovered reading a book called Conservatism by Edmund Fawcett, who used to write for The Economist. He's an uncle of Boris Johnson, but on the liberal side rather than the conservative side, though he writes very well about conservatism. And he says the reason we can't think of anything is the conservatives really don't stand for very much. It's the liberals who have the ideas and the conservatives who block those ideas or ameliorate the ideas, make them better. And it's a very decent role to play in a body politic, it seems to me. They believe in private property. Going back to Edmund Burke, they did not believe in expanding the franchise. Neither did the liberals. Nobody wanted the women to vote. Nobody wanted the shopkeepers to vote. But it all happened anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in terms of the conservative agenda, there are cultural elements to it that have to do with things like gender and sexuality, et cetera. So we've seen, for example, in this Senate race, a lot of discussion about the men and women's sports and those sorts of things. There's a whole constellation of issues surrounding that. There are certainly conservative priorities. We see these more at the state level with regard to education, educational choice, and things like that.
Yeah.
And then there are definitely conservative fiscal priorities, which typically center around lower taxes and traditionally have coupled those lower taxes with reduced spending. Although, as I said, that's the harder part, and so people don't talk about it as much. So.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a time when the Republicans were the party of defense, the party of law and order.
Well, they're definitely still that. They'll definitely talk about law enforcement and wanting to
Yeah.
increase border enforcement, border security. So, I mean, that would be part of the agenda for sure as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, we really need to turn to all of you. Actually, I thought that we might have some music and the two of you could dance for about.
I suggested that when we were trying to pull the audience together, maybe we could
Jim,
get our playlist going.
Yeah.
bring us a playlist. He didn't do it.
Yeah. Can we crank up Ave Maria? Is that,
Okay, please wait for the microphone and don't, be as concise as you can be.
I've been accused of a lot of things, but being quiet is not one of them. So I don't know if I need the microphone. A purely cephalogical question: which is going to be more important this presidential cycle, and why? Persuasion or GOTV?
Both of them are very difficult. Persuasion means that you are going to attract a Trump voter over to Kamala Harris by her advertising or something like that. Very little of that is going to happen. Polarization is very much a factor. And I read something just the other day about, this was Mike Murphy, who ran the McCain campaign some years ago, saying that get out the vote makes less difference in a presidential election than a congressional, state, or local election, because you've already got pretty high turnout. And so you're just really trying to add that last 0.75% that might put you over in a very closely balanced state. So both get out the vote and persuasion are going to move relatively few people, but in a very close election, relatively few people may be all you need to move.
And I would say that I think get out the vote is going to be more important than persuasion because of how hard it is to persuade anybody at this point, because of how polarized we are, how few swing voters there are. And the fact that get out the vote is important is actually, if I'm a Republican strategist, this is what gives me concern at this point, is because of the shifting nature of the coalition. So it used to be that Democrats were the ones that struggled to get out their people and Republicans always showed up and voted. But that was when Republicans were the party of higher income, higher education, reliable voters. That is less true now, right? The Republican coalition has moved downscale. The Democratic coalition has moved upscale, which means now that dynamic has begun to shift. And, one of the things, there was a Republican strategist, part of the Trump campaign, who was quoted, he was talking about the shifting coalitions in the electorate. And, the Republican concern is that they are losing votes from upper middle class, educated, particularly women in the suburbs. But at the same time, they're doing better than they've done in decades among particularly male minority voters, male Blacks and Hispanics. And this Republican strategist said, we're going to be okay. He said, for every Karen we lose, we pick up a Julio or a Jamal. Now, that's a kind of a crude way of expressing it. I'm quoting him. All right. But here's the problem with that, if you're that Republican strategist. Karen votes every freaking time, okay? A reliable voter. Democrats can well tell you, because they struggled with this for decades, getting all of the quote unquote Julios and Jamals to the polls is a challenge. It requires a lot of resources, right? It requires a lot of door-to-door community organizations. They don't just naturally turn out at the same rates. And so this is something that, particularly given the fact that Republicans have less money down the stretch than Democrats do to pay for get out the vote efforts, this is one element of concern that I would have if I were a Republican.
Yeah,
strategist.
Harris has a much more blown out get out the vote operation prepared than Trump does. Trump has farmed his out to some PAC organizations who haven't done it before. And so that gives you an additional sense that there may be a Democratic advantage on get out the vote.
I think there was Alan. Yeah, please. And then you, and then you. Let's have a couple of questions at once.
Hi, all. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. I think this election cycle in particular, Trump and both Harris have done a very good job at connecting with young voters. Do you think that the connections that they've made on social media actually translate to young people going out and voting this election more so than they have in the past?
I think they certainly think that it makes a difference, or they wouldn't be spending their time doing it, particularly down the stretch. Now, Kamala Harris was interviewed by Charlemagne the God recently. So she must know something I don't know, but she thought that was important to do. And Trump has been interviewed by some bro figures that think that it will bring out the young male vote. So they think that it makes a big difference. And really, when one side does it, the other side has to do it, right? You've got to match everything that the other side is doing. So, it's a new day.
Yes.
Of course, we're in the political times now, but I'm more concerned about the overall picture of where the United States is going. I mean, the Constitution was a secular constitution with the freedom of everyone to exercise the religion they so choose. I think that now there was separation of church and state. I think that is being lost little by little. And I'm really concerned about the future of the United States. Is the United States going to become a Christian state, like we have an Islamic state and a Jewish state? Could you address that for me?
So the short answer is no, I think, and because the demographics just don't support it. That is, you do not have a majority of the United States population that is devoutly church-going Christian. You have a majority of the United States population that's nominally Christian. But, imagining a kind of a genuinely theocratic regime like you see in an Iran or Saudi Arabia, I mean, that's unimaginable in the American context. Now, there are people, there are lots of different groups in America. That doesn't mean that they're going to succeed in all their vision of what they'd like to do. And Christian nationalism can mean a lot of different things, okay? If we take the kind of extreme version of what you might call Christian nationalism, the idea that other faiths should be made illegal, the number of people who believe that is vanishingly small. I mean, it is tiny. I mean, and so the prospects that non-Christian religions would somehow be outlawed and you wouldn't be allowed to practice Judaism or Islam, I mean, I honestly think the chances of that are zero. Now, a kind of a softer version of Christian nationalism, the idea that Christianity plays an important role in shaping the historical values and ethos of the United States. Now, that's a different proposition. A lot more people agree with that. That can play out in a variety of different ways. But I would say, and this is a bigger, broader point than just religion. I think that the American constitutional system is more robust than a lot of people want to give it credit for. And you hear people on both left and right very often say, we're hanging by a thread. If the other side wins, we're going to lose everything that's good about America. All your freedoms are going to be gone. I'm more hopeful and optimistic than that, regardless of which party prevails in the election. I think that there actually are viable guardrails in our system that make us able to weather the outcomes of elections one way or the other and retain our constitutional democracy. Now, some people might think that makes me naive, but I genuinely believe that. I am more hopeful than many about the robustness of our constitutional order.
I want to hear from some women. Beg your pardon? Oh, I see one in the back. Good.
Yes.
What I'm concerned about is what will happen if Trump doesn't win. Are we going to have another January 6th?
Is that Liz
Yeah.
Oliphant?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
So
I think.
no, another January 6th?
No, I don't think so. I think we may have some scattered disturbances around the country in various places. You think of Michigan, militia up there, that sort of thing. something in Arizona. But the reason it's not going to look anything like January 6th is on January 6th, Donald Trump gave a speech to the crowd. They headed for the Capitol. They trashed the place, and he sat in the White House wondering whether this was going to give him an opportunity to throw the election into the House. He's not in the White House. It's Joe Biden. And so any disruption in Washington, D.C. is going to be addressed immediately and enforced by the sitting Democratic president. And if Trump does win, he'll be more than happy. And the Democrats aren't going to storm the Capitol. So I think the issue is whether the people disappointed that Trump didn't win, if he doesn't win, take some action in the streets. And if that happens, again, I think it's scattered around the country, nothing focused on Washington, D.C.
Do I see someone else on the back row there? And Lynn Novak, are you in? Then Lynn, and then right here, I think someone, you have a microphone. We'll do all three.
Yes, I do have a comment and a question. I think you you spoke very honestly. I do think you're being naive, Dr. Wilson, because I think that if you look at what is being done in the public schools, I have served on a board of education for 8 years, a long time ago, and I will tell you that the amount of work that's being put into changing curriculum, to censoring books. This is 1938. This is not 2024 anymore. And these people are in it for the long haul. They are not in it for next year. They are the I have nothing about homeschoolers, but when I see what they want and how they want to present it, and the 10 commandments, I'd like to know which 10 commandments they're putting up. I'd like to know which Bible they want people to read, not for the academic information, but for the religious information. So when we talk about this, it doesn't matter if we maintain the Constitution, maybe sort of, if Mr. Trump gets in. It is the question of what happens with the moneyed people behind him that have the opportunity to buy school board elections, to make them political, to change those things, and to influence children, and to deal with creationism. So I don't think that this is something that we can just overlook and say, yes. So I guess I'm not asking the question, and I'll stop talking, but I'll hope that you'll reconsider your naivete, because I think it is very naive, and I have seen what's happening.
Lynn. And then we'll get three questions and hear from the two of you.
Okay, we finished with that question?
Okay, and incidentally, you know, Jim, our friend Abe Lowenthal used to say, you need not disguise your question. I mean, need not disguise your comment as a question. Just go ahead and make a comment. Lynn.
To follow up with Dr. Gilson's point, the Democrat Party base does seem to be transitioning away to perhaps the self-styled elites, the more highly educated, the Wall Street crowd, the Silicon Valley billionaires. I cannot understand why they would support, through their votes and influence and giving money to a party that would tax unrealized capital gains, advocate a top marginal bracket of 80%, and have significantly more antitrust activity. Well, is this an emotional reaction because they hate Trump so much? Or this seems anti to their interests across the board.
Can I just clarify? You just said something I didn't know. They want to raise the marginal tax rate to 80%? Okay, go ahead, Cal. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was not aware of that either.
Maybe it's not.
So, you know, the issue is, again, that a lot of stuff that gets discussed in an election should be thought of as a sense of direction that each party would like to take. The specifics, I think, you don't worry so much about, because we're going to have divided government, very close divisions, even if it is a one-party government. The margins are going to be very small, so you're not going to get a lot of that done. But I think what investors hate more than Donald Trump is instability, right? And it's the instability that Trump brings to politics and economics that they're concerned about. If you watch Donald Trump talk about tariffs, it is absolutely incoherent. And it's not only incoherent, it's just wrong by 180 degrees, right? And so if you are someone running billions of dollars on Wall Street and you got a guy who has no clue what his major policy goal would do, you know, it tends to make you fairly nervous. And so I think that that change taking place in the Democratic Party is a willingness to look at him and listen to him. And that's why Harris's brother-in-law and other Democrat economists are going around Wall Street you know, the money centers in Boston, around the country, talking to wealthy people about how to think about economic development going forward in order to try to give them a chance to register their views, let them feel heard, sort of take any concern out of them. But our parties are still being reshaped at this point, and what they'll become is not entirely clear.
We have a question at the back, and then we have a guy here who's waited very patiently. So let's do the two of them. I think we need a microphone on the.
I've got one. I just didn't know how to turn it on.
Oh, okay, great.
My question was on, y'all mentioned some demographic shifts that you expected to happen within the Democratic Party becoming more elitist and then the Republican Party becoming more populist. In the future, I was wondering if you could expand on what some of the platform changes you might expect then for the parties would be if the demographics shift over the next few years.
So one thing, we're already seeing some of this happen. So we've seen this happen within the economic platform of the Republican Party. So this shift to a more blue-collar Republican Party explains why the Republicans are now advocating things like tariffs, why they're advocating things like more restrictive immigration policy, why they are advocating, you know, things that are more the economic priorities of people making less than $100,000 a year. You're seeing more and more of that make its way into the Republican Party talking points, platform, et cetera. On the Democratic, and therefore also a lot more vocal skepticism of corporate power from the Republican Party than you would have seen 30, 40 years ago. I mean, Republicans are much more critical of big, you name it, than they were, you know, 30, 40 years ago, much more critical of big tech, corporate power, the concentration of financial resources that allow influence over policy. All of that kind of rhetoric and discussion is a reflection of this demographic shift. On the Democratic side, it's very clear that within the Democratic coalition, those Democrats with more wealth and higher levels of education care a lot more about left-wing culture wars positions than do Democrats with lower levels of wealth and education, who tend to prioritize pocketbook issues. And so the more the Democratic Party becomes a wealthy, highly educated party, the more you're going to see them foreground culture wars type things, because that's what, you know, wealthy, well-educated white liberals want them to do. And I mean, that's not just my opinion. All the public opinion surveys show that. Those issues resonate more with wealthy, well-educated white liberals than they do with other members of the Democratic Party. So, I mean, I think that's going to be a kind of issue shift that you would see.
Yes, it's finally your turn.
So speaking as like a college student, when I look at all my peers and my friends, it's apparent that it's really candidate focused rather than policy focused. And I was wondering if going into like future elections, especially with how like the recent presidential debate went, will it stay candidate focused or will it start to shift back to policy?
Yeah, tell me, what's the other word? It's not policy, it's what?
Candidate focused.
Oh, yeah, right. You know, I think for most voters, no one in this room, but most voters don't have the depth of policy knowledge in detail. even though they ask for it all the time. They don't go to websites and read all of this sort of stuff. And so they're reacting and responding to what they see and hear and the feel of that for them. Is there a resonance or not? And so I think, again, the candidate presence is very important, and the policy discussion is, again, directional, as opposed to this is precisely what I'm going to do, because almost no candidate, even those who win elections, get to do what they want to do, right? And so I think policy is always there, but for many, many voters, reacting to persona and to presentation and to whether you think that person would understand you and your needs and interests is the first part of moving them in the direction of one candidate or the other.
Lynn,
Okay, I wanted to ask a couple of quick things. Well, one quick, one not so quick. The first one is, are any of the crazies in the House or Senate on either side likely to be beaten this time? That's probably a yes or no answer. And the other question is, Donald Trump is acting more and more like he has dementia. And his rants and his swaying to the music and all of that is scary. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance is very close to Donald Jr. and supports the 2025 Heritage program. So is there a chance that Trump could get elected with the idea that they would soon call him non-compos menace and then JD would become the president? With Donald Jr. there?
Yeah, I would just very quickly, there were a couple of very liberal Democrats who got beat in the primaries this time, and that was 2 of the 4 in the
Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman.
Right, exactly. And so there was some culling out there, and you know, a little bit on the Republican side as well. But you know, Donald Trump is you know, a strange figure, and you know, being non-compos mentis is a slide that he may be on, but he can still provide the direction to the party for some time to come. I don't believe that there's a scheme to have him declared and removed and J.D. Vance put in. But if you think back to when Joe Biden was still the candidate for the Democrats and was declaring that he was determined to run, a very great many Democrats said, he's our guy. We're going to stick with him. Even when there was real concern that he also was on a slide toward incompetence. So partisanship is incredibly strong on both sides and is at some level a danger to us all if we can't just look at these guys and say, on the face of it, I'm not willing to go with this guy anymore, particularly when it's your guy, right? And neither side is willing to do that.
Lynn, I do like the sort of Game of Thrones mentality that you reflect there, that there's some sort of scheme by Don Jr. to stab his father in the back and assume power. It's it's really, it's remarkable. But
now Don would do it. We're not saying he wouldn't do it.
I take no position on that, but
yes, right back there.
Okay, so both as a young person and a woman of color, I've heard a lot about how like young people and people of color have the ability to kind of influence elections in certain ways, kind of similar to what we saw back in 2020, I think with a lot more people kind of being motivated to get out and vote. Do you guys kind of anticipate or see something similar happening with this election? Or do you think that kind of identity politics are beginning to play less and less of a role in elections?
I'll say really quick, I do think, with the question of turnout, I do think turnout overall is going to be lower than it was in 2020. But that's just because 2020 was a very, very high bar, and because it was a lot of electoral laws were changed to allow mail-in voting and stuff like that. So I think we're going to come down somewhat from a relatively high baseline. But it will be interesting to see the relative turnout of younger people vis-a-vis older age cohorts, because as someone mentioned before, both campaigns have made some real outreach efforts through non-traditional media to try to connect with younger demographic constituencies. We'll see if that bears fruit. We'll see if they are actually able to turn some of those folks out. One of the very interesting things with regard to young voters, and I'll be interested to hear what Cal has to say, a really interesting thing with young voters is that of all the different age cohorts in the electorate, the gender gap in partisan preferences is the biggest by far among young people, among people under 30. That is, the partisan preference of men under 30 compared to women under 30 is much further apart than the partisan preference of, say, 50-year-old men compared to 50-year-old women. So that's a very interesting dynamic that we're going to have to look at going forward. And you even see it in those non-traditional media outreach that the two candidates are doing. Trump is specifically targeting media outlets that speak to young men. And Kamala Harris is specifically targeting media outlets that speak to young women. And so that's going to be an interesting kind of intersection of age and gender that we're going to watch play out.
Yeah, we haven't mentioned Call Your Daddy. Yeah,
That's the one that appeals to young women.
Kamala Harris podcast. We just got a couple of minutes here. So very quickly, traditionally, young people your age voted only about half the rate of adults, say 55, 60, 65 years old. But in 2020, that number came up. And to the extent that it comes up, those are votes that both candidates want to harvest. And one candidate may have an easier time doing it, Harris, most likely. As voting increases among young people, the candidates compete more for them. If voting is low, they ignore them in favor of those who know they're going to vote at the top. But as to turnout in 2024, I would just note that the first day early vote in Georgia was 3 times what it was in 2020. Now that, by the end of early voting, that may trail off and it may not be a great deal different, but it shows that there's tremendous agitation out there and interest out there about this election and its implications. So.
Yes, one more, and then we go to Jim.
Are you indicating?
Well, all right, 2 more, because I see someone write, well, 3 more. Oh, we have the consul from Canada. We want to hear from Canada.
We're going to bring in COTS a little bit.
I'll go ahead. Haven't discussed illegal immigration and the flood of illegals who are in our country. We're hit most of it because we're here in Texas, but our neighbors to the right, Arizona and California. Do I really need this? Okay. So I'm going to read you a statistic from ICE from September 27th. 425,431 total convicted criminals. 13,099 convicted of homicide. 15,811 convicted of sexual assault. So, who do you think is going to be better for our country when it comes to legal immigration and stopping the flow of illegal immigration and the fentanyl and all of the sex trafficking and human trafficking that we have had and that this country has suffered under with the Biden-Harris administration? Thank you.
Crime is down 22%.
I think the Democrats will be better on legal immigration because they favor legal immigration, where Republicans don't favor very much legal immigration and certainly are staunchly opposed to illegal immigration. And we need the workforce. I get a Social Security check and I damn well want younger people working and paying Social Security taxes so that check keeps coming. And we're not making enough babies ourselves, so we need legal immigration. And we need a system that rewards talent and assets, educational assets, financial assets, and others. And we need people to do the kind of work that needs to be done in this country. Illegal immigration, the Trump was very stern on that. Biden came to it very late, but the numbers are significantly down. And the reason we haven't talked too much about immigration is because it's a political issue. It's not a voting issue, and we've been talking about voting. So I'll simply say that voting by illegal aliens is very, very rare, despite all of the stuff you hear about it from Paxton and Abbott and others.
But just really quick, it is an issue in the campaign. And there's no doubt that Trump will take a harder line on the border and illegal immigration than Harris would. Whether you favor that or not, it's a whole separate question. But I mean, pretty clear that he will take a more restrictionist stance than Harris would. And among those voters who say that immigration is a high priority issue for them, it's one that plays overwhelmingly in Trump's favor. It's one of the issues that works for him with the electorate. Now, it's not the most significant issue. The economy polls as most significant, but very often it polls number 2. And so that it has been a major part of his campaign because it's something where he seems to be getting some resonance with the
Okay,
electorate.
I think we're right back there.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, that's on. Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this and taking my question. I'm a student here at SMU studying theology, and historically, I can see how people prior would look to the religious organizations, 50s and 60s, for their beliefs. But now I find that people are looking to match their political beliefs to their organization. I think of independent evangelical churches or independent Baptist churches, and even on the liberal side with the United Methodist Church and some other movements as well through Episcopalianism and things like that. Do you think that this nuance is accurate or it's something different?
So I think you're exactly right. And there's a lot of research in sociology of religion and religion and politics that suggests this is increasingly true. I mean, we would normally think that the way things work is that people derive their values and worldview perhaps from religion, many people do, and that based on that system of values and worldview, they in turn choose political party, political allegiances, political candidates. But there's a lot of evidence that suggests that this relationship for a lot of people has reversed. And in fact, that they have these deep set political loyalties and choose a church or choose a religious organization to match their political convictions. Used to be the case that most churches were very politically diverse. There were, most African-American churches are a special case, let's put them aside, but white American churches were pretty politically diverse, both Catholic and Protestant. And so you would sit in the pews next to people who voted for somebody different than you did. That is less and less and less true. That is, people are increasingly choosing their religious organization because they say, I will not worship next to somebody who voted for X. And therefore, it's the political animosity and bitterness is driving religious self-selection. And I think that is absolutely something that we observe happening in the United States. Conservatives only want to worship with conservatives. Liberals only want to worship with liberals, or they don't want to worship at all, but that's a whole other story. But that's
Okay, do we have more up here? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a great evening and really interesting conversation. Obviously, we're talking about the election, and the election is one little microcosm at the ground level. If we go back and think about the past 30, 40, 50 years of this country, did the country, by promoting, doing all the work that we've done, trade with China and other low-cost places, do we really gut out what was the American opportunity, the American way to get a job, improve, save some money, have a family, help your family get educated, advance, et cetera, and be able to, buy a second car and do all the things that people did, go on a vacation. There seems to be such polarization in our country, not just political, but truly economic. So the election is important, but are we actually, what is it we can actually do as a country to get out of this pathway that we're on right now? Because we don't really seem to be rising as a nation Everyone is not coming along with us. More taxes, inefficient government throwing out that money, probably not going to be a solution. But what is it we could do to actually get out of this? Because I think that we're heading in a downward direction with a lot of separation within our own country.
Yeah, I think that the ideal pattern of economic development for a wealthy nation is to move systematically up from agriculture to manufacturing to knowledge work, right? And so as part of the free trade agenda, we did privilege low-cost goods made elsewhere by countries just moving into manufacturing, which would have been fine if we had thought of it in terms of our workforce needing to transition toward those upper levels of value creation, right? Sort of through manufacturing to knowledge work, to invest in transition, in job training, in helping people go to community college and then beyond to college. But we took the low-hanging fruit of that cheap foreign labor and goods being provided, but we didn't invest in the bottom half of our workforce in a way to move them up into a competitive status, because we're interested in cutting taxes and not spending on those kinds of work. We'd like to tell people get on workfare, right? If you get welfare, then you need to work. So we haven't invested in the bottom half of our workforce the way we might have over those last 50 years.
Let's hear from our friend from Canada. You're the cleanup hitter.
Well, thank you, and I admit I am Canadian. I was fortunate enough to be at an event last month where President Bush and Secretary Gates were speaking. And when asked what was keeping them up at nights, they said, both of them, isolationism. And I found that chilling, but I would say not surprising, given what we are seeing globally at the moment. And I notice it's a topic we haven't touched tonight. So I'd like your views on both their comments and on the general issue. Thank you.
So just speaking personally, I share their concern. I think that the isolationist bent in American foreign policy thought is concerning. I would say it's not the dominant strand. It's not the dominant strand in either political party yet, but it is increasingly prominent. It's a larger and larger minority within particularly the Republican caucus in the House. Some of the loudest voices on the Republican side are isolationists, but when push comes to shove, Republicans overwhelmingly want to aid Israel. More than half of them want to aid Ukraine, have voted for all the Ukraine aid bills. They remain committed to NATO. So the American global foreign policy apparatus and consensus is holding for now, but there are more voices challenging it than there once were. I don't think that the voices challenging it are likely to prevail. There's an enormous amount of foreign and defense policy inertia that exists within, and I hesitate to use this word, but the deep state. And the deep state within the US government tends to keep us on some remarkably consistent foreign policy trajectories, no matter who wins. And I think that there's a lot of that will continue going forward regardless of the outcome.
Yeah, I think the danger is a little greater than that, in the sense, particularly if you think about Ukraine, the deterioration in support for Ukraine, particularly on the Republican side, seems very dangerous. And there is, and has been for a long time, a sense that our allies oftentimes don't pay their fair share. But the way you get to be and remain leader of the free world is picking up the lion's share of UN costs, peacekeeping costs, lots of other kinds of global institutions that are held together by US leadership and assets. And you don't get to be the leader unless you provide those assets as well. So I think if we want to be the leader of the free world, and I think we do want to and should want to for our own and the world's interests, we need to be willing to pay for it.
Okay, I thought we had the cleanup from Canada, but nonetheless, up here.
One more question.
Good.
Hi, thank you all for being here and putting this on. You guys talked about the potential for Speaker Jeffries if the Democrats take back the House, and either way, we're going to have a new Republican leader in the Senate, it either being John, or John. I was curious, though, if the Republicans were to lose the House, what do you think will happen to Speaker Johnson? Do you think that he would keep his role as the Republican leader in the House, or do you think that it would kind of turn into Rock'em Sock'em Robots and we'd see another Kevin McCarthy-esque fight for the speaker or for the leadership?
Yeah, if Republicans lose the majority in the House, I think Johnson will be gone as their leader. And even if they don't, I think it could be Rock'em Sock'em Robots on that side. So, you know, I think Johnson has done a reasonable job under the circumstances, which is that he's got a dozen Republicans who don't want to listen to him at all. That's bigger than his majority. He has to depend on the Democrats when any major issue comes up. And that's deeply embarrassing for a Republican leader. So I don't see him as a long-term leader of the Republicans in the House.
Unfortunately, we've reached 8 o'clock, and I think we could probably stay here until about 10 or 11 o'clock. And I know that a lot of you are frustrated because you still had questions to ask. But, you know, as the director of the Tower Center, I can assure you there are going to be more opportunities. We're certainly going to reconvene. There are going to be some programs after the election. So have a chance to come back, and we'll see what comes next. But I want to stop the program here and thank everybody who worked so hard to put this on. And please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you.